The morning Cora Thatcher arrived in Dusthaven, Texas. She was wearing her best blue dress and carrying a lie she had not yet figured out how to put down. The year was 1879, and the town of Dusthaven sat like a forgotten coin in the crease of the Llano Estacado, where the wind never quite stopped and the red dust settled into everything: your hair, your lungs, the corners of your eyes. Cora had traveled 3 days by stagecoach from San Antonio, and before that she had endured a week on the Southern Pacific Railroad from Georgia, and before that she had endured 22 years of being told exactly what her life was supposed to look like. She was supposed to arrive in Dusthaven and become the wife of Edmund Rourke, eldest son of the Rourke cattle dynasty, a man she had exchanged exactly 11 letters with over the course of 4 months. She had his photograph in her traveling bag, a serious-faced man with a wide jaw and heavy brows who looked like he had never once found anything funny. The arrangement had been made between Edmund's father, Gerald Rourke, and Cora's own father back in Savannah, sealed with a handshake, and the understanding that the Thatcher family needed the financial backing that the Rourke name could provide, and that Edmund Rourke, at 34, needed a wife. Cora had not been asked whether she wanted this. She had simply been told. She stepped off the stagecoach onto the packed dirt of Dusthaven's Main Street with her trunk being hauled down behind her, and she looked at the row of wooden storefronts. The general store, the telegraph office, Mabel's boarding house, the saloon with its paint already peeling in the heat, and she told herself that she was a practical woman. She told herself that plenty of women made sensible marriages and lived perfectly decent lives. She straightened her spine, adjusted her traveling hat, and waited. What came was not Edmund Rourke. What came was a man who moved the way water moves when it has somewhere it needs to be, not in any hurry exactly, but with a quiet certainty that it will get there. He was perhaps 26 or 27, lean through the shoulders in the way that comes from real work rather than from fashionable tailoring, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been lived in by the sun and the wind without complaint. He wore a worn leather vest over a cream-colored shirt, a battered hat that had clearly seen worse weather than today, and boots that were honest about the miles they had covered. He stopped about 3 paces in front of her and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite without being performative. "Miss Thatcher," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not waste itself. "I'm Homer Rourke, Edmund's younger brother. I've been sent to collect you." Cora looked at him for a moment. "Collect me," she repeated. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Poor choice of words. I apologize." "I've been sent to welcome you and see you to the ranch." He reached for her traveling bag before she could protest. "Edmund had some business come up with the cattle broker from Abilene. He'll be back by supper." "I see," Cora said, because there was nothing else to say. He loaded her trunk into the back of a buckboard with what appeared to be minimal effort, then offered her his hand to help her up onto the seat. She took it because the step was genuinely steep, and she noticed that his grip was careful, firm enough to be useful, gentle enough to be respectful. She filed that away without knowing why. The drive to the Rourke ranch took the better part of an hour, and for the first stretch of it they did not speak. The land opened up around them in that enormous Texas way, all sky and scrub, and the occasional flash of a jackrabbit disappearing into the brush. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised Cora, because silences between strangers were usually awkward things you felt obligated to fill. It was Homer who finally spoke. "How was the journey?" "Long," she said. The stagecoach out of San Antonio shook like it was personally offended by the road. He glanced at her sideways. "The road between here and San Antonio has been personally offensive since before I was born. The county commissioners keep promising to grade it and never quite get around to it. I suspect the road will be waiting for them on the other side of eternity," Cora said, and this time something did break across his face, a real, brief, genuine smile, gone almost before she was certain she had seen it. "Edmund mentioned you were from Savannah," Homer said after a moment. Born and raised, she confirmed. This is my first time west of the Mississippi. What do you think of it? She looked out at the vast sweep of the Llano Estacado, the way the light fell across it in shades of amber and ochre and gold, the way it made you feel simultaneously very small and very alive. I think it is nothing like what I expected, she said honestly. I expected it to be bleak. But it isn't quite. It's more like, it doesn't particularly care whether you find it beautiful or not, and somehow that makes it beautiful. Homer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I never heard anyone put it that way before, but that's exactly right. She looked at him, and he was already looking at the road ahead, and she told herself firmly that she was tired from travel, and that tiredness made everything feel more significant than it was. The Rourke ranch was substantial, a proper two-story ranch house built from limestone hauled up from the creek bed, with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, and corrals where maybe 3 dozen horses moved in the afternoon heat. Gerald Rourke was waiting on the porch, and Cora recognized the patriarch's look immediately. The assessing eyes, the practiced smile, the way he shook her hand as though he was confirming a business transaction had arrived safely. Miss Thatcher, welcome to the Double R, Gerald said warmly, but with the warmth of a man who had calculated the precise wattage required. Edmund will be terribly sorry to have missed your arrival. Come inside, we'll get you settled. Edmund's mother, Vera Rourke, was a quieter force, a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen enough of life to be kind about it. She took Cora's arm and guided her inside and up the stairs to a guest room that looked out over the eastern pasture, and she said, You must be exhausted, dear. Rest before supper. The men will still be exactly as complicated after you've had some sleep. Cora laughed, genuinely surprised by it, and Vera smiled in a way that suggested she was pleased to have accomplished something real. Edmund arrived at 6:30, and he was precisely as serious-faced in person as in his photograph. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and had the manner of a man who had been the eldest son his entire life, and had absorbed all the gravity that position required. He greeted Cora formally in the parlor, with Gerald beaming beside him, and he said all the correct things, that she was more lovely than her photograph, that he hoped the journey had not been too taxing, that he was looking forward to getting to know her better. His eyes were flat and courteous, the way a man's eyes are when he is doing what is expected of him with reasonable efficiency. Cora smiled and said all the correct things back, and the whole exchange felt like two people reading from scripts they had been handed by other people. Homer sat at the far end of the supper table and said very little, though Cora was aware of him in a way she could not precisely explain, the way you are aware of a candle flame in a room even when you are not looking directly at it. The days that followed established a rhythm. Gerald Rourke had planned an engagement of 3 weeks before the wedding, which he said was a sufficient amount of time for the couple to become acquainted and for the necessary arrangements to be made. Edmund took Cora for a ride in the buggy on the second afternoon and spoke at length about the cattle operation, the water rights issue he was managing with a neighboring rancher named Stroud, and his plans to expand the herd once the new wells were dug. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had organized his inner life around business the way some men organize it around faith, and there was no room in the accounting for much else. Do you like to read? Cora asked him on that second afternoon because she had to ask something. I read the ranch ledgers every morning, Edmund said pleasantly, and then continued talking about the price of longhorns in the Abilene market. Homer, meanwhile, was everywhere she turned without ever seeming to be following her. He was the one who fixed the loose board on the porch steps because he had noticed her nearly catching her heel on it. He was the one who appeared with a glass of cold water from the well one morning when she was sitting on the porch with her sketchbook, the sun already brutal at 10 in the morning. He was the one who, when she wandered down toward the corrals on the 4th day because the confined quality of the parlor was making her feel like a piece of furniture, did not act surprised to see her, and simply kept doing what he was doing, working with a young chestnut mare, speaking to her in a low, continuous murmur that was too quiet for Cora to make out the words. Cora leaned on the top rail of the corral fence and watched. After a while, Homer said, without looking at her, "You can come in if you want. She won't spook at you. She's nervous around loud things, not quiet ones." Cora climbed through the fence rails carefully, mindful of her skirt. Homer handed her a bit of dried apple from his shirt pocket and showed her how to hold her palm flat so the mare could take it properly. The mare's nose was velvet soft against her hand. "What is her name?" Cora asked. "Hasn't got one yet," Homer said. "She came to us 3 weeks ago from a ranch over near Midland whose owner lost everything in a drought. She doesn't trust people much. Can't blame her." Cora stroked the mare's nose gently. "Maybe she just needs time to believe that not everyone who wants something from her intends to take more than they give." The words came out with more weight than she had intended, and she was aware, suddenly, of Homer's stillness beside her. She did not look at him. "That's a reasonable thing to need," he said quietly, and then he went back to his work with the mare, and Cora stayed for another half hour and nobody said anything else, and it was somehow one of the most honest conversations she had experienced since arriving in Dusthaven. On the 6th evening, a thing happened that Cora did not know how to categorize. Edmund had ridden out to deal with the water rights matter with Stroud, and Gerald had gone to bed early with a headache, and Vera had retired with her sewing. Cora found herself alone on the front porch in the blue dusk, watching the first stars come out over the western horizon with a kind of desperate attentiveness, as though the stars might tell her something useful. She heard the screen door open and close, and Homer appeared beside her with 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed her one without asking whether she wanted it, which she found she did not mind because she did want it, and then he leaned against the porch railing and looked at the same horizon she was looking at. "You can tell me it's none of my business," he said after a moment. Cora wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "Tell you what? That you don't want to be here." The directness of it made her chest contract. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her steadily, with that same quality of attention he gave the difficult young mare, careful, without demands in it. "I don't know what I want," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said since getting off the stagecoach. Homer nodded as though that was a legitimate answer. "That's a difficult place to be. Were you consulted," she asked, "about any of this arrangement?" His mouth did something wry. "Nobody consults the younger son about anything except which pasture to move the cattle to." "And yet you seem to have opinions," she said. "I always have opinions," he said. "I've just learned which ones are worth the breath." She looked back at the stars. "What is Edmund like, really? Not the version he shows to people he is trying to impress." Homer was quiet for a long moment. "Edmund is a good man who has been told his whole life that being a good man means being productive and serious and carrying the weight of the family name without complaint. He's not wrong to believe that. I think he got so focused on being what everyone needed him to be that he lost track of what he might actually want. That," Cora said softly, "is not entirely unlike my own situation." Homer looked at her. The stars were coming out properly now, the Milky Way beginning to ghost itself across the dark. The night air had cooled and smelled of dry grass and the faint sweetness of the mountain cedar in the gully below the house. "Miss Thatcher," Homer said, and something in his voice had changed, had gone quieter and more careful in a way that made her feel like she was being offered something fragile. "I only have one question to ask you, and I hope you'll forgive me for asking it." She looked at him directly. "Ask it." "Are you happy?" 3 words, the simplest possible arrangement of them. And the devastation they caused in her chest was entirely disproportionate, because no one, not her father, not Edmund, not Gerald Rourke with his practiced warmth, not a single person in Dusthaven had asked her that, had thought to ask her that, had considered it a relevant variable in the equation. She felt, without any warning, the pressure of tears behind her eyes, which was humiliating and also, somehow, right. She blinked hard and pressed her lips together, and Homer did not look away from her and did not make any move to comfort her that would have forced her to compose herself before she was ready. He simply waited. "No," she said at last. "I am not." Homer nodded. He turned back to the horizon and drank his coffee, and after a moment he said, very quietly, "Then we have a problem worth solving." She stared at him. "We." He looked at her again, and she saw something in his face that she recognized with a shock of certainty even before she could put a name to it, because it was the same thing she had been experiencing all week without letting herself examine it, the warm, persistent awareness of him, the way her mind kept returning to him the way your tongue returns to a sore tooth, not from pain but from the helpless recognition of something that is there. "Yes," he said. "We." That night she lay awake in the room that looked out over the eastern pasture and thought about a cowboy who asked questions instead of issuing conclusions, and she understood that she was in a great deal of trouble. She went to Edmund the next morning. She had spent the night and the early hours of the morning working through it methodically, because Cora Thatcher was not a woman given to impulse. She had thought about her father and the financial arrangement. She had thought about propriety and the 1879 world's rather firm opinion on what women did and did not do with their futures. She had thought about Vera Rourke's kind eyes and Gerald Rourke's calculating ones. She had thought about Edmund's flat courtesy and Homer's careful attentiveness, and the question he had asked her, those three simple words that had split her open like a seam coming undone under pressure. She found Edmund in the ranch office, going over the ledgers with a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up when she knocked on the open door and gestured her in with the manner of a man who expected this conversation to be about wedding preparations. She sat in the chair across the desk from him and said, "Edmund, I need to speak honestly with you, and I hope you will hear me out before responding." He set down his pen. His expression was careful, the way a man's expression is when he senses the ground shifting and hasn't yet determined the direction. "I have thought very carefully about this," she said, "and I believe that an honest conversation now is better than an honest reckoning later, and I hope that we can have it without either of us becoming unkind. The truth is that I do not think we suit each other." The silence that followed was considerable. "My father," Edmund began. "I know," she said gently. "I know about the arrangement. I know what is expected. And I am not saying this lightly, and I am not saying it on behalf of a passing mood or a bad night's sleep. I am saying it because I think you deserve a wife who is genuinely glad to be your wife, and I think I deserve a marriage that I have actually chosen, and I don't think either of us has been given the chance for that here." Edmund stared at her for a long moment, and then something happened that she had not expected. His face did not harden with offense. Instead, something in it seemed to quietly collapse inward, the way a man's shoulders drop when he puts down a weight he has been carrying so long he had forgotten he was carrying it. "You're not wrong," he said at last, in a voice that was rougher than his usual measured tone. "Is there someone else?" she asked, because she was thorough. "Someone you would have chosen if you had been permitted to choose." Edmund was quiet for a very long moment. Then he said with some care, "There is a widow woman in Dusthaven, Clara Mead. She runs the millinery shop. We have talked on a number of occasions." He paused. "My father considers her unsuitable because she is a widow with a young child." "Your father," Cora said firmly, "is wrong." Edmund looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something real in his eyes, a startled, cautious, wondering thing. "What do we do about our fathers?" he said. "We handle them," Cora said, "together, as friends if you are willing." Edmund looked at her for another long moment, and then he extended his hand across the desk, and she shook it, and they were both, she thought, considerably lighter on their feet when they stood up. Gerald Rourke's reaction was a different matter entirely. He summoned Cora to the parlor that afternoon, Edmund must have told him, which was the right thing to do, and also clearly the thing that caused the volcanic quality of Gerald's color. And he stood by the fireplace looking as though he would have liked to throw something into it. "Miss Thatcher," he said, in a voice that had been carefully restrained but was straining at its restraints, "I have an arrangement with your father that represents a considerable financial commitment. I trust you understand that." "I do understand that," Cora said. She had seated herself in the parlor chair with her hands folded in her lap and her spine entirely straight, because her mother, before she had died when Cora was 15, had told her that a woman could survive any difficult conversation if she kept her back straight and her voice even. "And I regret any inconvenience to you, Mr. Rourke. But I would point out that you have been making an arrangement about my life without my participation, and that whatever financial discussion was had between yourself and my father, I am a person and not a piece of property to be transferred." Gerald stared at her. "Furthermore," Cora continued, "I believe Edmund will be considerably happier in a marriage he has chosen than in one that was chosen for him. And a man who is genuinely happy makes a better steward of a ranch and a family name than one who is quietly miserable. If you think about it from a practical standpoint, you will find that I am doing you a favor." The silence in the parlor was absolute for a full 30 seconds. Then from the hallway she heard a sound that she identified, despite being muffled behind a closed door, as someone failing to suppress a laugh. She had a very strong suspicion she knew whose laugh it was. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man who prided himself on reading situations clearly, and she could see him doing that now, reading and recalculating. He had a son who was not unhappy about this development. He had a woman who was not going to be moved by financial pressure, and who had, annoyingly, made a practical argument. He had a ranch to run and a reputation to manage. "What," Gerald said finally, with the exhausted tone of a man accepting reality, "do you propose we do about the arrangement with your father?" "I propose that you write to my father explaining that the match was found to be unsuitable on both sides, and that we agree that no financial penalty should attach to either family, since no wedding has yet taken place and therefore no breach of contract has occurred. I propose we part on decent terms." She paused. "My father is a proud man, but he is also a practical one. I believe he will accept this if it is framed correctly." Gerald sat down heavily in the armchair across from her. He rubbed his face with both hands. "You are an extraordinarily composed young woman," he said, though she could not quite tell if it was a compliment. "I have had to be," she said simply. Gerald wrote the letter that evening. Edmund, with a new lightness about him, rode into Dusthaven the following morning on some errand that everyone in the house appeared to tacitly agree not to examine too closely, and Cora suspected, though she had no evidence, that the errand might have passed by the millinery shop. Cora herself spent the morning with Vera Rourke in the kitchen garden, because Vera had asked if she would like to help thin the bean seedlings, and Cora had found that her hands needed something useful to do. They worked in companionable quiet for a while, and then Vera said, without looking up from the soil, "My younger boy has been smiling more this week than he has in 2 years." Cora pulled a weed from around a bean plant with considerable attention. "Has he?" "He's not a complicated man," Vera said, which was almost certainly untrue, but Cora understood what she meant. "He doesn't say much, but he feels things very deeply. He always has. When he was small, he would bring me every injured bird he found in the pasture, absolutely certain we could fix them." She paused. "We couldn't fix most of them, but he never stopped bringing them." Cora sat back on her heels and looked at Vera, who was looking at her with an expression that was gentle and clear-eyed, and not at all pretending to be about anything other than what it was about. "Mrs. Rourke," Cora said carefully. "I am not interfering," Vera said serenely, returning to her bean plants. "I am simply a woman working in a garden who occasionally notes things out loud." That afternoon Homer found her at the corral again. She had come back to the chestnut mare, who now accepted her presence without rolling her eyes or sidling away, and was standing with her nose against Cora's shoulder in a posture that the mare had apparently decided was appropriate. Homer came and leaned on the fence from the outside, watching. "I spoke to Edmund this morning," Cora said. "I know," Homer said. Your father is not entirely pleased with me. My father will survive it, Homer said. He always does. He's like the county road, endures everything and refuses to improve. She laughed, and the mare startled slightly and then settled, and Homer looked at her with that clear, direct gaze that she had stopped trying to prepare herself for, because preparation was useless. What will you do? He asked. You can't stay here indefinitely. No, she agreed. I have been thinking about that, and she had been all the practical angles of it. She had a small amount of her own money, savings from the needlework and lessons she had done in Savannah. She had her skills, which were considerable. She had been well educated, could sew, teach, manage accounts, speak French moderately well. I thought perhaps I could inquire about a position in Dusthaven. The school teacher, I was told by the stagecoach driver, left in March, and the school board has not yet found a replacement. Homer was very still. You'd stay in Dusthaven. I thought I might, she said, looking at the mare's mane rather than at him. If there is a reason to stay. The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever experienced. She could hear the horses moving in the far corral, the distant creak of the windmill, the steady pushing breath of the Texas wind. Cora, Homer said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed in her chest with the warm precision of a key finding a lock. She looked at him. His hands were on the top rail of the fence, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, because it was made up of too many things at once, earnestness and caution, and something underneath both that was large enough to make her a little breathless. I have been trying very hard all week, he said, to behave properly. I know, she said. I'm not accustomed to feeling things this quickly, he said. I don't trust it as a general rule. Quick feelings tend to be. He stopped, started again. But this doesn't feel quick exactly. It feels like it feels like I already knew you somehow, and the last week has just been the part where I remembered. Cora gripped the fence rail on her side. The mare huffed gently against her other shoulder. Homer, she said, and her voice was steady but only just. What was the question you asked me on the porch? The real question. He looked at her for a long moment. The real question, he said slowly, was probably whether there was a chance that the reason you were not happy was something that we could. He stopped. Something in his face that was usually carefully managed went briefly unmanaged. I wasn't asking whether you were happy with Edmund. I was asking whether you could be happy, here, with. He stopped again. With you, she finished. With me, he confirmed very quietly. She climbed through the fence rails, which was undignified in her skirt, and she walked the 3 paces to where he was standing, and she looked up at him from a distance of about 2 feet, and she said, I think the answer to your real question is yes. Homer looked at her for a moment as though he was verifying that he had heard correctly. Then he reached out and took her hand carefully, as he had done everything, and held it in both of his, and she felt the warmth of his grip travel up her arm and spread through her chest like the first real heat of spring, and she thought, with something like incredulity, that this was what it was supposed to feel like. They stood there in the Texas afternoon, with the wind moving through the scrub brush, and the horses shifting in the corral and the enormous sky overhead, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed to be said. The practical business of Cora's situation still needed attending to, however, and Homer was nothing if not practical when practicality was called for. The following morning he rode with her into Dusthaven so she could speak to the school board, which in 1879 Dusthaven consisted primarily of 3 ranchers and the Reverend, all of whom met in the back room of the general store on Wednesday mornings. Cora presented herself at that meeting with her Georgia teaching certificate, which she had acquired at 19 through the state normal school program and which she had brought with her, not because she had planned to use it, but because she never traveled without it, the same way she never traveled without her mother's silver thimble. It was a piece of herself she kept portable. The school board was skeptical. One of the ranchers, a florid man named Harkins, pointed out that she was a young, unmarried woman who had arrived in town under unusual circumstances. The Reverend, A thin man named Caldwell, who had the eyes of someone who had seen more than he had bargained for, pointed out that the children of Dusthaven had been without a teacher for 4 months, and that Miss Thatcher came with proper credentials. Homer sat in the back of the room and said nothing, which was its own form of statement. The school board was not unaware that a Rourke sat in the back of the room, and the Rourkes were not unaware that the school board knew it. Cora got the position. Not because of Homer's silent presence, she told herself, but because she was genuinely qualified and because the children of Dusthaven needed teaching. But she would have been dishonest if she said the presence of a man in a battered hat sitting quietly in her corner had not warmed something in her. The question of where she would live was solved by Mabel's boarding house, which had a second-floor room with a window that looked out over the main street and cost $4 a month, which was within what the school board was paying her. Vera Rourke pressed a parcel of biscuits and a jar of honey into her hands on the morning she left the ranch, and Gerald shook her hand with a gruffness that had almost entirely replaced his earlier outrage, which she suspected meant he had decided to respect her even if he hadn't decided to admit it. Edmund embraced her briefly, as a brother might embrace a sister, and murmured that he thought things might be progressing well with Clara Meade, and Cora told him she was genuinely glad. Homer drove her into town in the buckboard, the same way he had driven her from it 9 days ago, and the difference between that drive and this one was the difference between two strangers sitting in a shared silence and two people learning each other's gravity. "You'll need to arrange the schoolroom," he said as they came into town. "Miss Penny, who had the position before, left it in some disorder, I'm told." "I will sort it out," Cora said. "I could come by Saturday and help move the desks," he offered, with the elaborate casualness of a man who has thought carefully about how to make an offer sound unremarkable. "That would be very practical," Cora agreed, with equivalent casualness. He looked at her. She looked at him. They both looked back at the road, and she was fairly certain they were both trying not to smile. The school building in Dusthaven was a single room with 6 windows, 18 desks of varying sizes, a blackboard that had seen better decades, and a wood stove in the corner for winter. It smelled of chalk dust and old wood, and the particular kind of child-accumulated history that exists only in school buildings. Cora stood in the middle of it on her first afternoon and felt something she had not expected to feel: rightness. Not the resigned rightness of someone making the best of a situation, but the clear, settled rightness of a woman standing in a place she was genuinely meant to be. She opened the windows to let in the air and started sorting through the jumbled books on the back shelf. School began on Monday. There were 14 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, including 2 Comanche children whose father had settled on a small parcel of land east of town, and who had been, Cora was told quietly by Harkins, not always welcomed as warmly as they should have been. This information made Cora's opinion of Harkins precisely what it had been before: negligible, and she made a point of calling on young Amma and her brother Kofi equally to the other students, and of arranging the reading groups so that ability rather than anything else determined who read with whom. By Wednesday the children had sorted her out. They always did. Children were perceptive in ways that embarrassed adults, and had determined that Miss Thatcher was strict about effort but generous about mistakes, that she expected good behavior but understood that good behavior required something to eat at lunch and a proper recess, and that she was genuinely interested in every question they asked her, no matter how tangential. By Friday they had decided they liked her, which was the only evaluation that mattered. Homer came on Saturday with a younger ranch hand named Pete to move the heavier desks into a better arrangement. He also brought a length of new rope for the flagpole, which had been making do with a frayed piece that could not have survived another winter. He fixed the flagpole rope, rearranged the desks as Cora directed, looked at the blackboard with a considering eye, and disappeared briefly to return with a piece of actual slate board he had apparently sourced from somewhere unspecified. "The mercantile had this in the back," he said, setting it against the wall. "It'll hold chalk better than the painted board." "Homer," Cora said, looking at the slate, "you did not have to do all of this." "I know," he said simply, and went back to fixing the hinge on the supply cabinet door that had been hanging wrong. She stood in the middle of her schoolroom and watched him work and felt the thing in her chest that she had stopped arguing with, because arguing with it was like arguing with the wind off the Llano Estacado. It was a waste of energy, and the wind would not change direction on your account. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up from the cabinet hinge. "Yes. Why are you not married?" She asked it directly, because she was finding that directness was the only language he both spoke and respected. "You are clearly a good man. You cannot have gone unnoticed." Something careful moved across his face. He returned to the hinge for a moment, settled it, and stood up. "There was a woman," he said, "2 years ago. Her name was Nellie Marsh. She was from a family over toward Lubbock." He paused. "She decided she preferred a man with more prospect than a younger son, which was a fair calculation on her part. It was not personal." "It sounds somewhat personal," Cora said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes. In the way that everything that happens to you is personal, even when the other person didn't intend it as such." He looked at her. "I don't tell you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I tell you because you asked, and I won't lie to you." "I know you won't," she said, and she did know it with the same certainty with which she knew her own name. He walked toward her and she stayed where she was, and he stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head up a little to look at him properly, and he said quietly, "What about you? There was no one in Savannah before all this." "There was a young man," she said. "His name was William Prescott. He was charming and handsome and entirely devoted to the idea of me rather than to me specifically. When my father's business began to fail, his devotion proved to have limits." She held his gaze. "I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me either. I am telling you because you asked and you were honest with me." Homer reached up and gently, carefully, with a precision that was all his own, tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face. His fingertips barely grazed her temple and she felt it everywhere. "We have both been done badly by people who should have known better," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "And yet here we are." "Here we are," he said. He took her hand, and they stood in the quiet schoolroom with the afternoon light coming through the 6 windows, and Cora thought that of all the things she had expected when she stepped off that stagecoach, this exact moment was not among them, and she was profoundly grateful for the ways in which expectations could be gloriously wrong. The weeks that followed were some of the finest of Cora Thatcher's life, though she would not have known to describe them that way until much later, because they were not dramatic in the way that stories tend to require. They were fine in the smaller sense, full of mornings where she walked to the schoolroom through the early light and found herself unreservedly glad about the day ahead, full of afternoons where Homer appeared with some quiet regularity, sometimes with an actual purpose, and sometimes with the manufactured purpose of a man who simply wanted to be near someone. Full of evenings where they sat on the boarding-house porch in full view of the whole Main Street, because it was 1879 and appearances were not irrelevant, and talked. They talked about everything. His childhood on the Double R, running wild in the pastures with his older brother before Gerald's ambition for Edmund had made Edmund too serious for wildness. Her childhood in Savannah, the smell of magnolias and the sound of her mother reading aloud on summer evenings. The way everything had changed when her mother died and her father's grief had curdled slowly into a kind of grasping anxiety. His time driving cattle up the Kisham Trail at 20, which he described with the unsentimental clarity of a man who had found the work genuine even when it was brutal. Her year at the normal school, the first time in her life she had felt herself genuinely among intellectual equals, the particular joy of a classroom full of people who wanted to know things. He was, she discovered, an extensive reader which she had not expected and which delighted her. He had a collection of books in the room off the bunkhouse that he occupied, which was separate from the main house. he having established his independence within the Rourke operation some years before. That included everything from a battered copy of Dickens, to cattle management manuals, to a volume of Emerson's essays that looked like it had been read a considerable number of times. "Emerson," she said when he showed her the shelf. "I would not have predicted Emerson. Self-reliance is a useful philosophy when you're the younger son," he said, without any bitterness, just the clear assessment of someone who had worked something out. She took the Emerson from the shelf and flipped it open and read aloud. "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." She looked up at him. "He would have approved of your porch conversation with me." Homer looked at her. "I think about that conversation more than is probably reasonable." "So do I," she said. He stepped toward her, and she stepped toward him, and they were standing in his small room off the bunkhouse with the late afternoon light coming through the single window and the sound of the ranch outside. And he kissed her for the first time with the same careful, certain quality that characterized everything he did, as though he had thought about it, decided it was the right thing, and committed to it fully. She kissed him back with a certainty that surprised her, because she had not known until that exact moment how much she had been wanting to. And then he held her face in both his hands and looked at her as though she was something he still could not entirely believe was real. "Cora Thatcher," he said very softly. "Homer Rourke," she said back. "I am entirely in love with you," he said in the same direct, unadorned way he said everything, without decoration or preface, just the clear and honest statement of a true thing. She felt her eyes go bright and told herself she was absolutely not going to cry in a room off a bunkhouse, which she then promptly did not manage. One tear, very precisely, tracked down her cheek, and Homer caught it with his thumb and looked at her with an expression of such attentive tenderness that she had to take a breath before she could speak. "I am entirely in love with you as well," she said. "Which I did not at all expect when I stepped off a stagecoach 3 weeks ago intending to marry your brother." He laughed, a full genuine laugh that she had not heard from him before, and it was a wonderful sound, warm and unguarded and completely without performance, and she filed it away as one of the most valuable things she had collected since arriving in Texas. They told his parents. This, too, required some navigation. Gerald Rourke received the news with an expression that moved through several stages: surprise, recalculation, a brief flare of something she could not precisely identify, possibly wounded pride that his carefully arranged plan had reorganized itself without his supervision, and finally, with some evident effort, a quality she could only call grudging acceptance. Vera Rourke, on the other hand, received the news with the serene expression of a woman who has been quietly waiting for the thing she expected to happen to go ahead and happen. She poured everyone more coffee and said, "Good. Now, Cora, I want to hear more about your mother's biscuit recipe, because I have been trying to perfect mine for 30 years and Vera Rourke does not admit defeat, but she does accept outside intelligence." Edmund, who came home that evening with a somewhat stunned and happy look about him that had nothing to do with Cora's news and everything to do with the afternoon he had apparently spent with Clara Meade, shook Homer's hand with the genuine warmth of a man who has been relieved of a weight, and told Cora she was the best worst match he had ever had the good fortune to fail to marry. The weeks continued. The school grew, because word spread that Miss Thatcher ran a proper class and did not favor any child over another, and 3 more students enrolled from families who lived on the edges of the school district. Homer, who had begun, gradually, without announcement, taking on more responsibility in the Rourke operation, as Gerald's health showed the first signs of the arthritis that would increasingly trouble him, came into town most evenings, and they took a walk along the creek at the edge of town, where the cottonwoods grew enormous and gold in the October light. One evening he brought her out to the Double R on a Sunday after church and took her to see the chestnut mare who had a name now. Vera had named her Rosie, which was not a particularly dignified name for a horse but was apparently entirely accurate. She let Pete put a saddle on her yesterday, Homer said, watching Rosie move in the corral. First time. You see, Cora said, she just needed time. Homer turned and looked at her, and she knew immediately that they were not talking about the horse. How much time do you need? He asked. For what specifically? She said, though she knew. For me to ask you to marry me, he said. I am not asking yet. I want to be clear that I am not asking yet. I am asking how much time you need before I ask. She looked at him for a moment. The October light was extraordinary on his face, that particular late afternoon gold that the Llano Estacado saved for autumn, when everything turned the color of a memory. You are doing this very correctly, she said. I am trying, he said, because you deserve someone who does it correctly. You deserve someone who actually asks you what you want instead of arranging it above your head. She thought about that porch, those 3 words. She thought about the past 7 weeks, which had been, if she was being precise about it, the first 7 weeks of her life during which she had been genuinely herself. Not the Cora who was supposed to be suitable, not the Cora who was supposed to be grateful, not the Cora being managed by anyone else's expectations. Just Cora, teaching her students and reading Emerson out loud in a room off a bunkhouse, and walking beside a man who wanted to know what she thought about everything. 3 months, she said, from now. January, he said. January, she confirmed. He smiled at her, not the careful, partial expression she had seen him use in the early days, but the full, unguarded one, the one that was entirely for her, and took her hand. October became November, and November in the Llano Estacado is not a gentle proposition. The norther came down at the beginning of the month with a cold that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in under an hour, and the wind became a thing with actual intentions. Cora, who had been raised in Georgia's mild winters, had never in her life been cold in the way that a Texas panhandle norther is cold. It is not polite. It is not gradual. It comes for you with a directness that the wind off the land understands as simple honesty. Homer showed up at the schoolhouse on the morning of the first norther before she had even managed to get the stove fully going, with extra firewood in the buckboard, and a look on his face that was somewhere between practical and exasperated with the weather. You need a heavier coat, he said, looking at the wool coat she had brought from Georgia, which was adequate for Georgia and laughable for Texas. I am perfectly, she began. You are shivering, he said, not unkindly. Practical observation, not a criticism. He brought her a coat from Dusthaven's general store the following day, a proper sheepskin-lined one, heavy and warm, which he said he had put on his account, and which she told him she would repay him for, and which they both knew, with the pleasant shared understanding that was developing between them, that this argument would have a leisurely and entirely enjoyable resolution at some future point. She wore the coat and was grateful for it every single day for the remainder of November and the entirety of December. December brought its own business. Edmund, who had by this point been quietly and consistently spending time with Clara Meade for the better part of 2 months, came to his father with a composed and absolute announcement that he intended to marry her in the spring. Gerald's objections went through several rounds, during which Vera served excellent pie, and made it clear with the gentle immovability of a woman who has been patient for a very long time that she thought Clara Meade was a fine woman, and that Edmund's happiness was not a lesser consideration than the Rourke family reputation. Cora, who was present for part of this because she had come to Sunday dinner, and Gerald, had apparently decided that ongoing arguments about his son's romantic choices were not worth relocating for, listened from her chair in the corner, and thought that Gerald Rourke was, underneath his calculations, a man who loved his family and was gradually, painfully, learning to trust that they knew what they needed. Clara Meade, when Cora finally met her, was a woman of 31 with calm brown eyes and a son named Teddy who was 6 years old and had already, apparently, become deeply interested in everything Homer said and did, following him around on his ranch visits with the dedicated intensity of a small naturalist studying a large, interesting animal. "Your boy has attached himself to my brother," Edmund said to Clara one Sunday afternoon with a tone of moderate bewilderment. "Teddy attaches himself to people who are genuinely kind," Clara said simply. "It's quite reliable." Homer, who was in the yard teaching Teddy how to properly coil a rope, was conspicuously too far away to have heard this. Christmas on the Double R was an event. Vera had been cooking for a week, and the main house smelled of pine and cloves and roasting meat, and Gerald, who had made a visible decision to enter the holiday with goodwill even if he had not arrived there entirely on his own, was in better spirits than he had been all autumn. Homer had driven into Dusthaven and come back with several wrapped parcels that he distributed with the same calm matter-of-factness with which he did everything, and Cora found herself unwrapping a small, beautiful, leather-bound journal, tooled on the cover with a pattern of wild flowers. That could only have been selected by someone who had been paying very close attention to the things she valued. She looked at him across the parlor. He was watching her with that expression she had come to know as his most private one, the one where his careful exterior went transparent for a moment, and you could see all the way through to how much he meant. "Homer," she said. "The flower there is the Texas bluebonnet," he said, pointing to the central motif on the cover. "In case you wanted to know." "I did want to know," she said, and pressed the journal briefly to her heart in a gesture she would have felt embarrassed by with anyone else, and he saw it, and the transparent expression stayed on his face for a long, warm moment. After the Christmas meal, when the dishes were cleared and Gerald had dozed in his armchair, and Edmund and Clara sat together on the porch settee with Teddy asleep between them in a way that suggested some futures were already making themselves known, Homer found Cora standing alone at the parlor window looking out at the cold stars over the Llano Estacado. He came and stood beside her, and after a moment he said, "January is almost here." "3 weeks," she said. "Are you still?" "Yes," she said before he could finish. She felt him exhale beside her, which told her that he had been holding something he would never have admitted to holding, and she turned and looked at him with the full and honest attention that she had learned from him, and said, "Homer, do you know what I thought when you first met me at the stagecoach?" "That you were uncertain about the whole situation," he said. "That you moved like a man who had somewhere he needed to be," she said. "Not in a hurry, just certain." He looked at her. "I did not know then that the place you needed to be was next to me," she said, "but I think perhaps you did." "I did not," he said, "not then. I thought I was collecting a woman for my brother's house and that I should be careful not to make anything awkward." He paused. "And then you said that the land was beautiful because it didn't care whether you found it beautiful or not, and I thought—" "You thought what?" she pressed. He looked at the stars. "I thought that I had never heard anyone understand this place so immediately and so correctly, and I thought that was a remarkable thing." He looked back at her. "And then I thought I should stop thinking about it and drive the buckboard." She laughed softly. He reached out and tucked her arm through his, and they stood together at the window with the cold Texas stars outside and the warm firelight behind them, and everything that needed to be settled was settled. The first week of January brought a cold, clear spell, the sky a blue so hard and bright it looked like china. Homer rode into Dusthaven on the morning of the 8th of January and came to find Cora at the schoolroom after her morning session, and he knocked on the door and took off his hat when she opened it, and he said, "The children are gone for the midday hour." "They are," she said. He stepped inside the schoolroom and she closed the door behind him, and he stood in the middle of the room where she had spent the last 3 months building something real, surrounded by the chalk-dusted desks and the children's primers and the new slate board, and he said, "Cora Eleanor Thatcher." "Homer James Rourke," she said, because she had learned his full name from Vera, which she had filed away for exactly an occasion like this. Something moved through his expression, surprised, pleased. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without a single moment of hesitation, and she meant it with every part of herself she had brought west on that stagecoach. All the practical parts and all the impractical ones. The part that kept her spine straight in difficult conversations, and the part that cried in rooms off bunkhouses, and the part that talked to horses and quoted Emerson, and stayed up past midnight with a new journal writing down things she had observed about the world that she was, for the first time in her life, entirely glad to be living in. He crossed the room and took her hands and kissed her, and they were standing in the schoolroom that smelled of chalk and old wood in the future, and it was exactly right. They were married in March, at the Dusthaven Church, with Reverend Caldwell officiating and the whole town in attendance, because Dusthaven in 1880 was the sort of place where a wedding was a communal event, and everyone had strong opinions about it. Vera Rourke wept with the specific pleasure of a woman whose certainty has been confirmed. Gerald Rourke shook Homer's hand first and then Cora's, and said gruffly that she was a remarkable young woman, and she said with equal gruffness and a private smile that she was glad he had arrived at that conclusion. Edmund stood up as his brother's witness with a genuinely happy expression, and Clara Meade sat in the front pew with Teddy on her lap and smiled at Cora over his head in the way that women smile at each other when they are both, through different paths, arriving at somewhere good. Cora wore her best blue dress, the same one she had stepped off the stagecoach in 7 months earlier, which felt right. It was the dress she had been wearing when everything began. She had added a length of ivory ribbon at the collar, and Vera had pressed it for her. And when Homer saw her come down the aisle of the little church with the March light coming through the plain windows, he looked at her the way he had looked at her on that first evening on the porch when 3 words had changed everything with complete attention, without armor. She walked toward him and thought, I was supposed to marry his older brother, and instead I am walking toward the man who asked me one question and trusted the answer and let it matter. And here, in all the ways that count, is where I am supposed to be. After the ceremony, there was a reception at the Double R, because Vera had insisted, and there was dancing, the sort of practical frontier dancing where a fiddle player from over near Midland played reels and waltzes with equal enthusiasm, and people danced on the cleared patch of ground in front of the ranch house under lanterns strung between the posts, and the night air was cool and smelled of cedar smoke, and the first wildflowers of spring beginning in the grass. Homer danced with her, which she had not known he could do, but which, once she thought about it, made complete sense. A man that deliberate about everything he did would not have failed to learn a skill he was likely to need. He danced with the same quiet certainty with which he did everything else, and she followed him with the ease of 2 people whose natural rhythms had already adjusted to each other in the weeks and months past. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was, of course, the only question he was always going to ask. She looked up at him with the full and absolute honesty that had become, between them, the only way they knew how to speak. "Yes," she said, "entirely." He smiled, the full, genuine, unguarded one, and turned her once under the lantern light, and around them Dusthaven danced and celebrated, and the Texas spring night opened wide above them, full of stars. They took up residence in a house on the eastern edge of the Double R property, which Homer and Pete and 2 other ranch hands had been building in November and December, a proper house, limestone like the main ranch house, with 3 rooms and a porch facing east, and a kitchen garden space that Vera had already staked out with proprietary interest. It was not large, but it was honest, built by someone who knew what a house needed to be and had taken care with every beam and stone of it. Cora unpacked her books onto the shelf he had built into the parlor wall, and arranged her mother's silver thimble on the windowsill, and hung a sketch she had done of the eastern pasture on the wall above the fireplace, and thought that she had never in her life set up a home that felt like hers, because it never had been before. Homer came in from the evening chores and found her standing in the middle of the parlor looking at everything, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her looking at the room, and something in his face was very quiet and very full. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that I would like to spend approximately the next 50 years in this room with you." He crossed to her and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, and they stood in their parlor in their house as the last light came in through the east window, and lay itself in long, warm stripes across the floor. The year continued to unfold with the generosity of years that are lived fully. Edmund and Clara married in June in a smaller ceremony, and Teddy Meade became Teddy Rourke with a thoroughness that seemed to satisfy everyone, including Teddy himself, who had apparently decided months ago that this was inevitable and was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. Gerald, whose arthritis was advancing but who was stubborn enough to manage it on his own terms, began a gradual process of turning more of the ranch's day-to-day operation over to both his sons, which in practice meant that Homer spent more time managing the cattle operation, and Edmund spent more time on the business and contracts side. And this division turned out to suit both of them considerably better than the arrangement that had existed before, where Edmund had been trying to do everything at once. Cora continued to teach school through the spring term because the school board renewed her contract and she wanted to finish the year with her students properly. In June, she taught her final class of the school year, sent her students home with their grade reports and a genuine sense of what they had accomplished, locked the schoolroom door, and walked home through the afternoon with her hands full of the wildflowers the younger children had pressed into her arms on the last day. She was, by then, 4 months along with their first child, a fact that was becoming increasingly apparent to the physical world, even if it had not yet been universally discussed in Dusthaven. Vera Rourke had known for 2 months, because Vera noticed things before they were ready to be noticed. Gerald Rourke had been told by Vera and had responded with the slightly stunned expression of a man encountering his own sentimentality without warning. Cora herself felt it as a kind of expansion, not just physical but in all directions, the same way the Texas horizon expands when you get out of the scrub brush and into open country, and you realize the sky is bigger than you knew. Homer was, about all of it, exactly himself. He was practical and steady and attentive, and he asked her how she felt with the same directness with which he asked her everything. And when she told him she felt wonderful but the heat was considerable, he built a better shade awning over the kitchen garden where she worked in the mornings and rigged a canvas windbreak that channeled the evening breeze through the front porch in a way that was genuinely elegant engineering for 1880. "You are solving all the logistical problems," she told him one evening. "I can't solve the other kind," he said, "so I solve the ones I can." "What other kind?" He looked at her. She was in the rocking chair he had placed on the porch, the evening breeze doing what his canvas windbreak promised, the western light going amber and gold over the Llano Estacado. "The kind where you're growing a person in there and it's considerable work and I cannot do any of it for you." "No," she agreed. "You can't." She reached out her hand and he took it. "But you can sit here." He sat on the porch step beside her chair and held her hand, and the evening came on in all its enormous West Texas splendor, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. The baby arrived on a September morning in 1880, which was a Tuesday, which Homer would always afterward claim was a sensible day to be born, because Tuesdays were neither rushed nor dragged like Mondays and Fridays. He was born just after sunrise, and Vera was there, and the midwife from Dusthaven named Mrs. Hurley, who had been delivering babies on the Llano Estacado for 20 years and had the unflappable calm to prove it. Homer had been in the parlor doing something entirely unconvincing with a piece of leather harness, while the sounds from the bedroom made him progressively less capable of appearing unconcerned. And then Mrs. Hurley came to the door and said, "You have a son," in the tone of a woman who has delivered good news enough times to know that plain delivery is better than ornamentation. Homer was in the room before the sentence was fully finished. Cora was exhausted and radiant in the way that women are in that specific hour, when the work is done, and the reward of it is immediate and absolute, and she looked up at him from the pillow with an expression that he would carry in his chest for the rest of his life, and she said, "Come and meet your son." The baby was small and red-faced and already frowning at the world with an expression that Homer immediately recognized as familiar. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Cora put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same careful, certain deliberateness with which he held everything fragile. And he looked at this new small person and felt something he had no adequate words for, which was unusual for a man who had, against all expectation, proven to have adequate words for most things. "He looks like he has strong opinions," Cora observed. "He's a Rourke," Homer said, and then caught himself and looked at Cora with a question in it. "And a Thatcher," she said. "He'll need both." They named him Daniel, for no particular family reason, simply because when they had discussed names in the quieter evenings of the summer, Daniel had been the one they both stopped at and stayed with, the way you stop at a right answer and feel no need to keep looking. Vera held Daniel with the absolute confidence of a woman who had been holding babies for 30 years and could do it with one hand while managing other affairs. Gerald held Daniel with the concentrated, slightly terrified tenderness of a man encountering a grandchild for the first time, and finding that this experience was doing something to him that he had not authorized. Teddy Rourke, who was now 7 and took his elder brother responsibilities very seriously, came to meet the baby with Edmund and Clara, looked at Daniel for a long moment with the analytic gaze of a child determining the parameters of a new situation, and then told Homer gravely that he had some experience with babies since his Aunt Rosa in Sweetwater had one last spring, and he was available to assist. Homer thanked him solemnly and said he would keep that in mind. The autumn of 1880 was a good one on the double R. The cattle market was strong. The rains had come at the right intervals that year, and the new wells Gerald had invested in were producing as promised. Homer managed the western pastures and the horse operation with an efficiency that made Gerald admit, in his roundabout way, that his younger son had grown into an exceptional rancher. Edmund, who was by nature better suited to negotiation and planning than to daily ranch work, had built a network of reliable contracts for the Rourke beef that guaranteed them fair prices without the uncertainties of open market fluctuation. They worked, the two brothers, with a complementary ease that had always been in them but had needed the right conditions to become fully visible. Cora, in the winter following Daniel's birth, wrote a long letter to her father. She had written him brief factual letters during the summer and fall enough to let him know she was well and where she was, but she had not written the full truth until she was ready to. And she found she was ready when Daniel was 3 months old, and she was sitting at the parlor table in the early morning, with the fire going and her son asleep in the cradle Homer had built and everything around her quiet and clear. She wrote honestly. She told him what had happened and why. She told him about Edmund and Clara, who were by all indications genuinely happy. She told him about Homer, and about the question that had changed everything, and about the schoolroom and the sheepskin coat and the chestnut mare, and the journal with the bluebonnet on the cover, and the house built from limestone on the eastern edge of the double R. She told him about Daniel, and she said she hoped he would meet his grandson someday if he could find it in himself to make the journey. She also told him, with love but with the firmness that Texas and the past year had reinforced in her, she was not returning to Georgia, and she was not available to be arranged again, and she was, for the first time in her memory, entirely herself in a place she had chosen, and she hoped he could be glad for her even if he could not fully understand it. Her father wrote back 4 weeks later. The letter was stiff in places. He was a proud man, and pride did not dissolve easily, but by the end of it he had written, "Your mother would have understood you better than I do, but I am trying. I am glad the boy is healthy. I am glad you are well." She read that last sentence twice, and felt the particular ache of love for a parent who is doing his complicated best, and she tucked the letter carefully into the new journal. Between pages she had filled with observations about the Texas sky, and the things her students had said that made her laugh, and the small daily record of a life that was fully and genuinely hers. Spring came back to the Llano Estacado with the usual lack of apology for winter. The bluebonnets appeared along the creek bed. that shocking blue that made the red dust look like a deliberate contrast. Rosie the chestnut mare, who had by now fully accepted the world's legitimacy, was in foal, which Homer had predicted, and which gave Cora a satisfaction she chose not to examine too carefully since it had a metaphorical quality she found almost too neat. Daniel, who was 7 months old and had developed a strong preference for being upright when the outdoors was available, sat on the corral fence with his father's hands around his waist and watched the horses with an attention that struck everyone who observed it as extremely Rourke-like, and also, somehow, extremely Thatcher-like, which made sense given that he was both. Edmund and Clara's first child together was born that spring, a daughter they named Margaret, who arrived with emphatic opinions about everything, and a shock of red hair that must have come from some Rourke ancestor too far back to be named. Teddy, who had now 8 years of experience with being the eldest, and took this role across the whole extended Rourke operation, informed anyone who would listen that he was going to teach Margaret to rope a calf as soon as she was old enough to hold the rope. Clara told him that was very ambitious, and she appreciated his commitment. Edmund told Homer, one evening when both of them were leaning on the corral fence watching the sunset with the quiet ease of brothers who had found their way back to each other, that he thought things had turned out considerably better than anyone had planned. "That is generally how the best things happen," Homer said. Edmund considered this. "Father planned it." "Father planned the first version," Homer said. "Cora sorted out a better one." Edmund smiled, the unguarded smile that Edmund reserved for the people he most trusted. "Yes, she did." The years on the double R continue to accumulate with the steady richness of good years that are not without difficulty, because nothing is without difficulty, and the Llano Estacado was not a place that accommodated complacency. There were dry seasons and difficult market years, and the ongoing complexity of the water rights dispute that Edmund eventually settled through negotiations that took 2 years, but arrived at a resolution everyone could live with. Gerald's arthritis progressed, and he spent more of his time on the porch that had become his domain, but his mind stayed sharp, and he remained the shrewdest observer of the cattle market in the county, which meant his opinions continued to be worth having even when his body could no longer implement them. Vera, who seemed to operate on a different law of time than everyone else, remained fundamentally unchanged. Her kitchen garden grew, and her biscuits improved, and she held every new Rourke baby with the same unhurried certainty that she had held all the others. Cora and Homer's second child, a boy named William for no one in particular, simply because it was a name they both liked and had set aside the first time, and found they had saved it, arrived in 1882, a red-faced, determined baby who from the very first day seemed to know what he wanted and be planning to get it, which his parents agreed was an excellent quality to have. Daniel, who was 2 by then, received the news of a brother with the philosophical acceptance of a child, who has spent 2 years being the center of considerable Rourke attention, and has concluded that he can share, as long as the sharing is on his terms. The schoolroom in Dusthaven had a new teacher by then, a serious young man from Abilene named Mr. Fairweather, who taught adequately and was warmly tolerated by the students, but was not, the parents of Dusthaven agreed, quite the same as Miss Thatcher, which Cora was told and accepted as the finest professional compliment she had ever received. She went back to teaching in 1883. When William was old enough for Vera to manage the boys on the mornings Cora was in town, because the school board wrote to her and asked, and because she had discovered that the part of herself that loved a classroom full of children who wanted to know things had not gone anywhere simply because she had been otherwise occupied. She negotiated a schedule of 4 mornings a week, which was practical and workable, and which Homer supported with the same uncomplicated attentiveness that characterized everything he did where Cora's ambitions were concerned. "You are very good at this," she told him once, meaning the way he held space for her without requiring her to occupy only the space he had designated. "At what specifically?" he asked. "At letting me be fully myself," she said. He looked at her. "It's not effort," he said. "You being fully yourself is the only version of you I have ever wanted." She took his face in both hands and kissed him in the kitchen in front of nothing but the afternoon light and the distant sound of the boys playing in the yard. And he kissed her back with the full, certain warmth of a man who has been doing this for 3 years and has not become any less attentive to the fact of how much he means it. By 1885, the double R had expanded in the direction that Homer had long believed it could go, not simply cattle, but horses. The demand for well-trained ranch horses was considerable across the Texas Panhandle, and Homer had a gift for the work that had been operating on a small scale for years and simply needed the space and the investment to operate properly. Gerald, who was now largely confined to his porch but whose financial instincts were still razor-sharp, agreed that it was a sound direction. Edmund negotiated the contracts. Homer built the program. Rosie, the chestnut mare who had arrived from Midland unable to trust the world, had produced 3 foals by then, all of them fine horses that showed her quality as a foundation. Cora had a proprietary feeling about this that she did not entirely suppress. On an evening in October 1885, one of those October evenings that the Llano Estacado does as though it is specifically trying to make an argument for its own beauty, all amber light and cooling air and the smell of cedar, Cora sat on the porch of the limestone house with Daniel, who was 5, and William, who was 3, and the 3 of them watched the horses in the near pasture while Homer worked in the barn. Daniel said, with the sudden completeness that 5-year-olds achieve, "Mama, why did you come here?" Cora considered how to answer a 5-year-old honestly without a complete account of financial arrangements and marriage contracts and stagecoach rides and a question asked on a porch in the blue dusk. "I came here," she said, "because this was where I was supposed to be. I just did not know it yet when I started." Daniel thought about this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Because of Papa." "Because of your Papa," she agreed. "And because of this." She gestured at the pasture, the horses, the enormous sky beginning to go rose and gold over the western horizon. "Because of all of this." William, who was 3 and not yet interested in philosophical discussions, was more interested in the grasshopper he had found on the porch railing, which he was examining with an intensity that suggested a future in natural history. Homer came out of the barn and saw them there on the porch, his wife and his sons in the October light, and he stopped walking for a moment, just to look at it, this life that had been built from a question and an honest answer. Cora saw him stop, and she saw what was on his face, and she felt it in her own chest with the same warm certainty she had felt every day for the past 5 years, that this was real and it was chosen and it was right. He came up onto the porch and sat beside her, and Daniel immediately clambered onto his lap with the unceremonious ownership of a child who has never doubted his welcome, and William presented the grasshopper for his father's inspection, and Homer looked at the grasshopper with appropriate gravity and said it was an excellent specimen, and then he looked at Cora over the top of William's head, and she was already looking at him. "Are you happy?" he asked, as he always asked, because it was always the right question. She thought of a stagecoach and a dusty street and a man in a battered hat who moved with the certainty of water finding its way. She thought of a porch in the blue dusk and 3 words that had split her open in the best possible way. She thought of a schoolroom and a chestnut mare and a journal with a bluebonnet on the cover and 2 boys who were entirely themselves and entirely wonderful and entirely here. "Yes," she said, because it was always the true answer, and between them, truth was the only language that had ever really mattered. "Yes, Homer, I am." He reached across and took her hand, and the October sun laid its final gold across the Llano Estacado, and the horses moved in the pasture, and the grasshopper escaped from William's careful grasp and disappeared into the scrub grass, which caused a small and vigorous protest, and Daniel said from his father's lap that he had seen where it went, which was probably untrue but was kindly meant. And the evening came on warm and complete, and full of all the things that a life is when it is being lived by the right people in the right place, having found each other by the grace of honest questions and braver answers. Gerald Rourke died peacefully in the spring of 1887, in his chair on the front porch of the main house, which was where he had always been most himself. He went looking at his pastures on a warm afternoon, and Vera found him there with his face in the sun and his hands still, and there was in it a kind of rightness that everyone who knew him recognized even through the grief of losing him. He had lived long enough to see his sons each find their proper place, which was more than many men were given, and he had slowly, in his own way, and never quite admitting it, arrived at the conclusion that love was not a lesser consideration than legacy, and that the two were not, in the end, as separate as he had always believed. Homer eulogized his father with the plain-spoken honesty that characterized everything he said, and there was not a person in Dusthaven who did not feel the truth of it. Edmund held himself together with the quiet fortitude of the eldest son, and that evening, sitting with Homer on the double R porch long after everyone else had gone to sleep, they talked about their father honestly and fully, the way brothers can when the subject of the conversation is no longer there to be managed around, and they found that they were each, despite everything, glad of who they had been given as a father, with all his complications. Vera stayed at the main house. She had no interest in going anywhere, and nobody suggested it, because everyone who knew Vera understood that she was the double R as much as any acre of land or any head of cattle. Edmund and Clara were there, and Teddy, who was 13 now and becoming a person of genuine substance. Margaret, 4 years old, was conducting an ongoing investigation of every corner of the ranch that showed no sign of concluding. The years continued. They were good years, marked by the ordinary extraordinary events of lives being fully lived. A drought in 1888 that everyone came through by collective care and practical cooperation, including a system Homer organized for sharing water access between the neighboring ranches that became a county-wide model, and was cited in the Dusthaven Gazette with an editorial noting that cooperative spirit was what distinguished community from mere proximity. A trip Cora and Homer made to Galveston in 1889, their first time away from the boys since Daniel was born, which Vera and Clara supervised with complete confidence, and which gave Cora and Homer 6 days of being only themselves together, walking the shore of the Gulf, which Cora had never seen, and which struck her with the same quality of enormous honest beauty that had struck her about the Llano Estacado 9 years before, though it was beautiful in an entirely different register. They ate seafood and sat on a hotel porch overlooking the water and talked for hours the way they always talked, and Homer said, looking at the Gulf, that he thought the ocean was what the Llano Estacado would be if the Llano Estacado had learned to move, which Cora thought was possibly the most Homer Rourke description of anything she had ever heard, and which she wrote in her journal that evening with the date and all the particulars. Cora's father came to visit in the summer of 1890. He had been corresponding with Cora consistently for the past 10 years, and his letters had softened progressively as the years revealed that she was genuinely thriving, and he arrived at the Dusthaven station on a June morning looking somewhat reduced by age and travel, but with enough of the upright Georgia pride remaining to make it clear that he was there by his own decision, and was not acknowledging that it had taken him this long. Homer met him at the station, as he had once met Cora, with the same quiet courtesy. Cora's father looked at Homer for a long moment, and Homer looked back with his characteristic directness, and then Cora's father said, "You take care of my daughter," which was not quite a question and not quite a statement but something in between. "She takes care of herself," Homer said. "I take care of being worth having around." There was a pause, and then something shifted in Cora's father's face and he shook Homer's hand properly. He stayed 3 weeks. He met his grandsons, Daniel, who was 10 and solemn and asked excellent questions. William, who was 8 and energetic and deeply interested in horses. He sat on the porch of the limestone house in the evenings and talked with Homer about cattle and weather and markets and the changes he had seen in the South since the war. And Homer listened the way he listened to everything, with genuine attention and without agenda. He watched Cora teach a Saturday lesson to the children of 2 ranch families whose parents had asked her to continue some of her instruction during the summer break. And he sat in the back of the schoolroom with his hat on his knee and watched his daughter move through the room with the ease and authority of a person doing exactly what she was meant to do. And his face, by the end of it, was a complicated thing. On the morning he left, standing by the Dusthaven stage, he took Cora's hands and held them the way he had not done since she was a small child, and he said, "Your mother would have loved this place." "She would have," Cora agreed. "She would have loved him," her father said, with a slight inclination toward Homer, who was loading her father's trunk. "She would have," Cora said again, and this time she felt the ache of it differently. Not as the loss she had been carrying for 25 years, but as a warm connection, a thread that ran from her mother to her and forward into everything she had built. Her father got on the stage and did not look back until the stage began to move, and then he did briefly, and she raised her hand, and then the stage went around the corner of the Dusthaven Main Street and was gone. Homer came and stood beside her. "He liked you," Cora said. "He doesn't show it dramatically," Homer said. "He is a Thatcher man," Cora said. "We are not dramatic by nature." Homer looked at her sideways. "You are somewhat dramatic." "I am a Thatcher woman," she said, "which is entirely different." He laughed and she laughed, and they walked back through the Dusthaven morning together, past the general store and the telegraph office and Mabel's boarding house where she had lived once in a second-floor room. And everything was familiar and right and hers in the full sense. And she felt, as she had felt for years now, and expected to feel for all the years that remained, the settled, spacious, genuine happiness of a woman who had arrived, through a route she could not have predicted and would not have changed, at exactly where she was supposed to be. There was one last thing that rounded the years properly, and it came in the autumn of 1891. The chestnut mare Rosie, who was 11 years old by then and had produced 6 foals and was, in the understanding of everyone who knew her, the finest horse on the Double R, was retired from breeding to a life of leisurely pasture, and whatever treatment a horse receives when an entire ranch operation has a sentimental attachment to her. On a warm October morning, Cora went down to the pasture where Rosie grazed and stood at the fence and watched her, and she thought about a scared, untrusting horse who had come from a failing ranch and learned, slowly, that not everyone who wanted something from her intended to take more than they gave. Homer came and leaned on the fence beside her as he had done on so many mornings in so many seasons. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The first day I met her," Cora said. He nodded slowly. "You told me she just needed time to believe that not everyone who wanted something from her intended to take more than they give." "I was talking about myself," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You knew then." "I suspected," he said. "I thought I should be careful not to confirm things I had no right to confirm at that particular moment." She shook her head slowly. "You are an extraordinary man, Homer Rourke." "I am a man who asked one question at the right time," he said. "And trusted the answer," she said. "And trusted the answer," he agreed. Rosie came to the fence and put her soft nose against Cora's palm, because she was that kind of horse now, the kind who came to the fence, who accepted her place with grace and warmth and the complete assurance of an animal who has found her right pasture. Cora stroked her nose and felt the October sun on the back of her hands, and the solid, warm presence of Homer beside her, and the sound of her boys' voices from somewhere up near the barn, where they were doing whatever 10- and 9-year-old boys did when left to their own devices on a ranch on a Saturday morning. And she thought that this was what a life looked like when it was being lived in the right direction. Not perfect, not without its difficult seasons and its dry years and its losses. Not without the grief of people who were gone, and the complications of people who were present, and the endless negotiations that any real life requires. But honest and chosen, and held between two people who had begun with a question and built everything else from the truthful answer. She turned to Homer, and he was already looking at her, as he so often was, with that expression that had stopped trying to keep anything back from her years ago and had simply given up the attempt as unnecessary. "Ask me again," she said. He understood immediately. He always understood immediately. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. This man who had come to collect her from a stagecoach, and had asked the only question that mattered, and had built a house from limestone and a life from honesty, and who had never, not once, required her to be anything other than entirely herself. "Yes," Cora Thatcher Rourke said, as she had always said when he asked, as she intended to say every time he asked for the remainder of their years together, as she said now with the full weight of everything she meant and everything she was and everything they had become, on a warm October morning in Dusthaven, Texas, with the horses in the pasture and the boys in the yard and the enormous beautiful sky of the Llano Estacado overhead, going on forever. Yes. Completely and entirely, and without any reservation in the world. Homer smiled and took her hand, and the morning went on around them, warm and full and closed in all the ways that happiness is closed, not sealed away from the world, but complete within it, needing nothing more than what it already was.